Okay, hello again. This is Adrian, and today we're going to be going over the Textfield weekly assignment number 2. So this one's called name concatenation, and it's basically going to involve two text fields we put on the screen in the middle here, where the user is going to type in their first name and their last name, and then it's going to concat those strings into a visible text widget down here that only updates once we press a button down here. So I've already kind of set this up since we went over the instructional video on how to create a stateless widget and extend that through a stable widget to create a home page. And I just have a column widget here with a scaffold widget with a body of a column in the center. And inside the column, we're going to get into the overall structure for it. Okay, so inside the padding, we're going to want to create a child of a text field, as shown here. Inside this text field, we're going to want to do a couple of things. One of them would be the controller, but we can add that on later. First thing we want to do is add some decoration, since we want to make it so that it's kind of visible, a little bit more visible for the user, as well as give them a label that they can read and kind of hint at what we would like them to input into it. So for the first one, we're going to want to create a decoration with a const input decoration as a parameter, and inside that there's a couple of different things you can kind of highlight over here and see all the different things you can implement, like an icon, a label text, hint lines, and basically you can make it so you can have a hint on the outside of the text field or inside of it, kind of as like a grayed out text. So that's what we're going to be doing in this case, which is just a label. You can do label or label text. In this case, I guess we'll be doing label, and this takes in a, I believe, text widget. Yes. So here we'll just to start off, we'll do first name, and after we get that, you can kind of see a little bit here on the right side, although it doesn't have a border around it. So inside the decoration, apart from the label, we will add a border. In our case, we'll just add a border with an outline input border. What this will do is, if you look on the right side, it'll kind of have the border with the hint whenever it's not selected. I believe if I just refresh the page, it'll show the hint in here as like a label text. However, when you click on it, it brings the hint or label towards the outside on the border. We're not only going to have one text field, we're going to have two. So what we could do is just copy and paste this padding. Oh. And in between each of these text fields, we can add a sized box. Basically, if you want to just have a simple way of adding some spacing in between each of these widgets, you can just add a sized box widget with a constant in front of it, so that gives a little bit of space. And then below that, we're going to want to have a text widget where we can display the concatenated names. So yeah, after we create this text widget, we're going to want to have a floating action button outside of the original body. So just get the end here and click enter and type in floating action button. So after we got all the basic widgets to this we need to display, we're going to work on the variables. So if you scroll up to here, the little my home page state. So the three things we ideally would need would just be three just string variables to keep track of either the first name, in this case, string last name, and we'll just do a temporary variable. So after we create these three string variables, there's a couple of ways of going about using the text fields. The most common way would be through a controller, text editing controller. So here we can just create a text editing controller of type just text editing controller and name it first name editing controller, and make the same thing for our last name. The other way would be through using the onChanged parameter in Textfields. So in Textfields, you can either do a controller and pass it in like this, where you have controller and first name controller. However, there's also another parameter where you can have onChanged. Whenever the text field's changed, you're able to have a different function called instead of just using a text editing controller. So I guess we can implement the text editing controller for the first one, and the second one we can implement a onChanged function and set the state of the variable. First, we would want to pass in a string value, since this is a type void function of with a string parameter. So here we will have a string value, which is whenever the text field is changed, it'll pass in the value that is currently being changed. So say, for example, type in ASDF, or here that's passed into this text widget, and you can kind of see how it's being updated here through the debug console. So inside this onChanged parameter, we want to be calling the setState function here, and what we'll be doing is just updating the last name value that is stored up here. So basically, we'll be taking that passed-in value that is being changed with that last name text field and updating that with setState so that it is being updated in real time to the last name parameter here. Then, since we have the controller for the first one and the onChanged parameter for the second text field, we're going to want to have an external function that updates the string down here that we're going to be concatenating these first and last names in, that we can call within the floating action button. First, create a void. We'll name it update name, for example. And inside this function, we'll want to call setState with a function where we update the first name. So you can kind of see here with controllers, what you want to do is set the first name to be the text passed in by the first name controller dot text. So if we had two controllers, you could do first name controller dot text and second name dot controller dot text, because those are the values that are being passed in and used in the controller parameter in the text field. Okay, so after we update the first name through the setState function, we've already updated the last name when we had the onChanged function. So that's the only difference between the two, is the controller will take care of it down here, but we'll have to update it outside in an external function. So after we've updated the first name and we already have the updated last name, we want to update the temp variable, which we are using to store the blank expression until we tell it to update. So in this case, we'll just want the first name and then last name as just a concatenated string, and inside we can just have whatever we want in front, so hello, and then inside we'll want to use the $, and then have the basic names of each of the functions inside of it. So you can just write hello $ first name space $ last name, and that won't give you any errors through VSCode, and it'll be nice and interpolated through that. And you can have any text in between each of these. However, the temp variable is not being used anywhere, as the text field down here is just simply using a string with a name as it. However, we can change this to be temp. As you can see on the right side, we have the 3 dots for the temp variable, and that's because we have a temp variable which is empty until we tell it to change through this updated name function. And basically what we have are these two temporary variables, first and last name, that are changed whenever we use the text controls, because the text controls automatically change it, and we don't want them to concatenate and make a new phrase down here until we've pressed this plus button. And so we've done that. However, we have the temp variable showing up, but there's nothing being changed. And even though we type our first and last names and click the plus button, there's nothing being changed about this. That's because we are not calling this update name function. So what we'll want to do inside this floating action button in the onPressed function, we can just call the function. So in this case, it's underscore update name. And after we save and exit out of this, we can hit Control S, and you'll see it update to hello, but the first and last name parameters are empty, so it won't say anything afterwards. However, if we type a string like my first and last name and hit plus, it'll say hello and then my first and last name, and then you can change this. So see how I'm able to change it, and the text editing controller is storing it all in one variable and not in temp, so the text down here doesn't change until we call this function while pressing the button. So I can change this to another chair's member's name, which is David Munn, and once you press plus, it changes it to that. So that's just about it. There's one last thing I'd like to mention, since it is pretty important with memory management and using text editing controllers. One thing we kind of forgot to go over was the dispose function. So whenever you have a text editing controller, it's always going to be currently running while running the app. However, when it's not currently in use, we want to clean it up from the widget tree, since there is what's called a widget tree whenever you run any app, and that'll put every widget that's currently being used or put onto the tree, and it'll keep constantly using memory to run each of those. However, when we call the text editing controller, when the app initially starts, it'll keep running even when it's not in use. So a good way to help prevent issues with that is to have an override function. So we just do that by doing the at override, and inside we can do dispose function, and inside of here we'll want to call first underscore first name controller dot dispose, and then just add some semicolons, and then afterwards you'll do this. Say you had like multiple controllers, like first and then last name, so you would just do first name and then last name. However, we only have one. So after you've done dispose of the original controller, we're going to call super dispose to call dispose on the parent function. So you don't need to know much in depth about what each of these do and what the importance of it. You can always search that up in the documentation that I linked below in the GitHub repository. However, you do need to implement these, as it is good practice for using text editing controllers. Another thing you can do, it is optional, is have an override of the initial state. So you can do that here. And basically what you can do is have an void initial state function that's being overridden, so that when the initial state of the app is ran, it'll set the text editing controller to be whatever is automatically in this first name thing. So say you had some variable that is saved even after the app closes, you can have it so that when the app is initialized, it automatically updates that and puts it into there. So we won't really be needing that for this case, since we're not implementing that kind of feature, but just something to mention. And apart from that, I feel like that's a pretty well-rounded app that we've covered. A lot of different features with setState and using the different types of text editing controller, as well as the onChanged parameter in Textfield. So that's all for today. I hope you enjoyed, and see you next time.